It started with a Facebook post. "That bitch is dead." At first, friends thought it was a sick joke. Dee and her daughter Gypsy were beloved in the community. A fragile mother-daughter duo who'd overcome endless medical battles together. Or so it seemed. But the words sat there, taunting, followed by something even more disturbing. "I fucking slashed that fat pig and raped her sweet innocent daughter." Springfield, Missouri, June 2015. Neighbors began to panic. Calls were made. Police officers arrived at a small pink bungalow. What they found inside would unravel one of the most disturbing and twisted cases of abuse, manipulation, and desperation in modern true crime history. The Blanchards lived in a modest house gifted to them by Habitat for Humanity. From the outside, it was charming, painted pink with a wheelchair ramp leading to the front door. Inside, though, it was a shrine to sickness. Rows of pill bottles lined the counters. Feeding tubes hung from IV poles. A wheelchair sat parked by the bed. Medical documents covered in doctor's notes stacked high, each describing another illness Gypsy supposedly suffered: leukemia, muscular dystrophy, seizures, even developmental delays. At the center of it all was Dee Blanchard, a woman in her late 40s, her eyes always wet with emotion as she described her daughter's suffering. The community adored her. Charities gave them money. Disney granted them trips. They were seen as living proof of perseverance. And then there was Gypsy Rose, the girl everyone pitied. Bald, toothless, wheelchair-bound, with a high-pitched voice that made her seem younger than she was. But what no one knew, what no one could even imagine, was that Gypsy wasn't sick at all. She could walk. She could eat. She was perfectly capable. But Dee had trapped her in a prison of fabricated illness. This was Munchausen syndrome by proxy, an extreme form of abuse where a caretaker invents or induces illness in a child to gain attention and control. Dee orchestrated every detail, shaving Gypsy's head, forcing unnecessary surgeries, and feeding her drugs to mimic symptoms. For years, Gypsy lived as a prisoner in plain sight, an able-bodied young woman locked inside the role of a dying child. By 2015, Gypsy was 23 years old, but mentally she was still treated as if she were 7. Dee controlled her every move, her food, her clothes, even her conversations. But Gypsy had a secret, late at night. When Dee slept, Gypsy would sneak onto the family's computer. There, in hidden chat rooms, she found an escape, her first taste of freedom. That's where she met Godejohn, a man with a troubled past, violent fantasies, and a willingness to do anything for Gypsy. Together, they hatched a plan. On June 14, 2015, Nicholas traveled to Springfield. While Dee slept in her bed, Nicholas crept inside with a knife. Gypsy hid in the bathroom, covering her ears. Moments later, screams ripped through the quiet house. Nicholas stabbed Dee over and over until the bedroom fell silent. Gypsy, trembling, stepped out from hiding. The woman who had ruled her entire life, her abuser, her captor, her mother, was dead. The crime was both horrifying and heartbreaking. A daughter's desperation had turned into a blood-soaked scene of betrayal. The next day, neighbors noticed something was wrong. The usually immaculate front yard was eerily quiet. Dee wasn't answering calls. And then came the Facebook posts. When police entered the house, they found Dee's lifeless body in her bed covered by a blanket. But something else was missing. Gypsy. At first, investigators feared the worst. Was this a kidnapping? Had Gypsy been taken, abused, murdered? But soon the truth began to unfold. Surveillance footage showed Gypsy walking on her own 2 feet. Records showed she had been lying about her illnesses for years, manipulated by her mother. Friends who had once pitied her now watched in shock as the facade crumbled. Police tracked Gypsy and Nicholas to Wisconsin, where they were arrested. In interrogation rooms, Gypsy's words stunned investigators. "I wanted to be free." The case exploded in the media. A daughter who killed her mother. A mother who had abused her daughter beyond comprehension. Who was the victim? Who was the villain? In court, Gypsy's defense painted a haunting picture. A lifetime of abuse so profound that violence felt like the only way out. Prosecutors, however, argued that murder could never be justified. During testimony, Gypsy described the years of fabricated illness. "She told me I couldn't walk. She shaved my head. She said if I told anyone the truth, no one would believe me." The courtroom sat in stunned silence. Nicholas's trial was darker. Chilling text messages between the couple were read aloud, detailing their plan. The stabbing, the cleanup, even their intimate fantasies. Nicholas showed little remorse, admitting that he killed Dee Dee because Gypsy asked him to. The words were heavy. They painted a portrait not just of murder, but of two broken lives colliding in tragedy. In the end, the court delivered its verdict: Gypsy Rose Blanchard, sentenced to 10 years in prison for second-degree murder. Nicholas Godejohn, sentenced to life in prison without parole for first-degree murder. The sentences shocked the public. Some argued that Gypsy was as much a victim as Dee Dee. Others saw her as complicit in a brutal killing. For Gypsy, prison became paradoxically her first taste of freedom. For the first time, she could eat what she wanted. She could walk without fear. She could cut her hair and choose her clothes. Behind bars, she discovered the autonomy she had never known. But the scars remained. The years of medical abuse, the betrayal, the murder, and for the community, the aftermath was equally haunting. How had no one seen the signs? How could a system of doctors, charities, and neighbors have been fooled for so long? The story of Gypsy Rose Blanchard is one of the darkest in recent memory, not because of the brutality of the crime, but because of the twisted path that led to it. A mother who should have been a protector became a captor. A daughter who should have been free to live became a prisoner. And when desperation reached its breaking point, the only escape left was murder. In the end, the tragedy leaves us with a chilling question. When the only way to escape abuse is through violence, who bears the greatest guilt? The victim who killed or the system that failed to protect her? The world may never fully agree. But one thing is certain: the Blanchard case is a story of horror, manipulation, and shattered lives. And its echoes will haunt us for decades to come. It was December 2013 when police arrived at a quiet, unassuming home in Mansfield, England. Neighbors had long wondered why the garden never seemed to change, why no one ever visited, and why the couple who lived there, William and Patricia Wycherley, had simply vanished years earlier. Shovels cut through the frozen soil, and then a stench. Cloth. Bone. What they unearthed was not a time capsule, not forgotten rubbish, but the skeletal remains of an elderly couple, buried side by side beneath the flower beds. Their lives erased, their identities stolen, and the killers? Not strangers, not burglars, but their very own daughter, Susan Edwards, and her husband, Christopher, who had hidden their crime for 15 long years, living off pensions and lies while the bodies decomposed just feet away from their old bedroom window. This was not just a story of murder. It was a story of fantasy, delusion, greed, and the darkness of a daughter who chose her Hollywood dreams over her parents' lives. A quiet, working-class neighborhood where neighbors minded their own business. The Wycherleys lived in a modest, semi-detached home, ordinary, almost invisible. But behind closed doors, tensions brewed. The victims, William and Patricia Wycherley, elderly, private, and not particularly well-liked. They were distant with their daughter Susan, and according to her, often cruel. William reportedly mocked her inability to have children. Patricia criticized and belittled her. To Susan, their home was not a place of warmth but of humiliation. The killer, Susan Edwards, shy, bookish, withdrawn from the world. Obsessed with old Hollywood films and classic stars like Gary Cooper. She was the type of person most would pass on the street without noticing. But her quiet demeanor masked something darker: resentment, greed, and a dependency on fantasy to escape reality. The enabler, Christopher Edwards, her husband. Equally reclusive, equally obsessed with film memorabilia. Their marriage was toxic. Two fragile psyches feeding each other's delusions. Together they built a fantasy life, one that required money they didn't have, and so resentment curdled into something unthinkable. It was a May bank holiday weekend in 1998 when Susan and Christopher traveled to Mansfield. They had told neighbors it was just a visit. But behind closed doors, another story unfolded. In the Wycherleys' bedroom, as the elderly couple prepared for a quiet weekend, Christopher raised a revolver. 2 gunshots tore through the silence, one for William, one for Patricia. The details remain murky: who fired first, whether there were arguments, whether Susan pushed Christopher into pulling the trigger. But one fact is certain: both William and Patricia were left lifeless in their own bed, executed by the people meant to love them. The killers dragged the bodies into the garden. Under the moonlight, they dug shallow graves among the flowers, covering the evidence with soil. The house, once filled with arguments and bitterness, now stood silent. But instead of remorse, Susan and Christopher felt relief and opportunity. The Wycherleys' sudden disappearance should have raised alarms. But Susan was clever. She forged letters, sent cards, and answered inquiries, pretending her parents were alive and well. She told neighbors her parents had moved away. She told officials they were traveling. Every lie bought her more time. Meanwhile, she and Christopher drained the Wycherleys' bank accounts, collected pensions, and even sold their home. For 15 years, they built their fantasy world, buying Hollywood memorabilia, autographs and posters as if the ghosts buried in Mansfield had never existed. But lies cannot last forever. By 2012, the Department for Work and Pensions grew suspicious. The Wycherleys, supposedly in their 90s, hadn't been seen by anyone in years. Officials pressed for interviews. Panicked, Susan and Christopher fled to Lille, France. But there, their fantasies crumbled. Money dried up. Debts piled. And in desperation, they returned to England not to confess but to beg for help. They claimed they had killed in self-defense. That William had been abusive. That Patricia had been cruel. But investigators weren't fooled. Shallow graves, bullets, and 15 years of fraud told the real story. The garden became the stage of truth. Forensic teams uncovered the Wycherleys' remains. 2 lives reduced to bones and silence. The trial in 2014 gripped the public. A daughter killing her parents, hiding them beneath the garden, then forging their lives for over a decade. It sounded like fiction. But it was chilling reality. In court, Susan appeared small, nervous, almost childlike. Christopher sat beside her, pale and obedient. Their lawyers painted them as fragile, abused people, pushed to breaking point. But the prosecution revealed the darker truth. Greed and resentment had driven them. The Wycherleys weren't simply murdered. They were executed to fund Hollywood fantasies. One prosecutor said coldly, "For 15 years, the Edwards lived not in fear, but in comfort. Comfort paid for with stolen lives and stolen pensions." The jury listened as letters were read aloud. Susan's forgeries, maintaining the illusion that her parents still lived. Each word dripped with deception, and the victims? Their voices were gone, their lives erased. Only their bones pulled from the soil spoke for them. The verdict was heavy but inevitable. In June 2014, both Susan and Christopher Edwards were convicted of murder. Each received a minimum sentence of 25 years in prison. The courtroom was tense as the sentence was read. Some saw justice served. Others wondered if Susan's claims of abuse should have lessened her fate. But for investigators, for the neighbors who had lived beside a graveyard for years, for the community that had been deceived, the weight of the crime was clear. This was a murder born not of desperation, but of selfishness and fantasy. In prison, Susan's delusions continued. Reports suggest she still clung to her Hollywood obsessions, writing letters, retreating into fantasy. Christopher faded quietly into the prison system, a man who had buried his life alongside 2 corpses in a garden. But the true aftermath belonged to the victims. William and Patricia Wycherley, 2 elderly souls who deserved peace in their final years, had been reduced to soil and silence, their dignity stolen by the one person they trusted most. The case of Susan Edwards forces us to confront a chilling truth. Evil does not always appear monstrous. Sometimes it is quiet, shy, bookish, hidden behind glasses and polite smiles. For 15 years, no one knew that beneath a Mansfield garden, 2 bodies lay rotting while their killers built fantasies out of stolen pensions. And so, the question lingers. What is more horrifying, the murders themselves or the fact that no one noticed for so long? In the end, the story of Susan Edwards is not just about death. It is about erasure. The erasure of parents by their child, the erasure of truth by lies, and the erasure of humanity when fantasy and greed consume reality. As the prison doors closed on Susan and Christopher Edwards, the garden in Mansfield finally told its secret. And it whispered a haunting reminder. Sometimes the most ordinary homes can hide the darkest graves. The taxi driver thought it was odd. A large, heavy suitcase abandoned in the back of his cab at the St. Regis Hotel in Bali. The young American couple who had placed it there, an 18-year-old girl and her boyfriend, were nowhere to be found. As he waited, the driver's suspicion grew. The bag smelled. Something wasn't right. When police forced it open, their worst fears were confirmed. Inside, bent at impossible angles, wrapped in blood-soaked sheets, was the lifeless body of 62-year-old socialite Sheila von Mack. Her skull fractured, her face beaten beyond recognition. Her daughter, Heather Mack, was nowhere to be seen. What the world would soon learn was that this was no random act of violence. This was a family tragedy born of resentment, rebellion, and greed. A mother murdered by the very daughter she raised, and the body stuffed into a suitcase like discarded luggage. Bali is a place people go for paradise. Luxury resorts, turquoise waters, the promise of escape. But for one family from Chicago, it became the setting of a nightmare. The victim, Sheila von Mack. Sheila was cultured, wealthy, and well-connected. She had spent her life in elite circles, surrounded by art, philanthropy, and privilege. But she was also strict, controlling, and unrelenting with her only child. Friends say she wanted the best for Heather, but Heather saw her mother's rules as suffocating chains. The killer. Heather Mack, at just 18 years old, Heather embodied rebellion. She was privileged yet volatile. Behind her glamorous image lay years of conflict with her mother, arguments that often turned violent. Court documents later revealed a history of police calls from Chicago, where Heather accused her mother of abuse, and her mother accused Heather of being dangerous. And then there was Tommy Schaefer, Heather's 21-year-old boyfriend. To Sheila, he was nothing but trouble, a man with no prospects, no wealth, and a bad influence on her daughter. To Heather, he was freedom. Together, they became toxic, and toxic love has a way of ending in blood. On August 12, 2014, Sheila, Heather, and Tommy checked into the St. Regis, one of Bali's most luxurious hotels. What was supposed to be a vacation quickly turned into a powder keg of tension. Sheila despised Tommy. She accused him of using Heather for money. Their arguments grew louder, sharper. Witnesses recalled seeing Sheila furious, her voice echoing through the halls. In the hotel room, rage boiled over. Tommy later admitted what happened. Sheila insulted him, calling him worthless, telling him he had no future with her daughter. Enraged, he grabbed a metal fruit bowl from the table. One blow, then another, the sound of metal cracking bone. Sheila's screams muffled against the walls of the suite. Blow after blow until her skull caved and the room fell silent. Heather watched. Some reports claim she egged him on. Others suggest she hid in the bathroom as her mother's life was beaten out of her. But what is certain is that when it was over, she helped stuff her mother's body into a suitcase. Blood smeared the sheets, staining the pristine white linens of the luxury hotel. The smell of death filled the air. Together they hauled the suitcase down to a taxi, telling the driver they'd be right back. They never returned. When police found the body, Bali erupted with scandal. The American heiress and her boyfriend were missing. An international manhunt began. Hours later, Heather and Tommy were found hiding in another hotel, shivering and terrified. At first, Heather played the victim. She claimed Tommy had acted alone, that she was too scared to stop him. But investigators found text messages that told another story. Days before the murder, Heather had messaged Tommy about her mother, describing her as controlling and abusive. In one chilling exchange, Heather wrote, "She's ruining everything. I can't take it anymore." The motive soon became clear. With her mother gone, Heather would inherit millions. And with Tommy by her side, she believed she could finally live freely. But freedom built on blood doesn't last. The trial in Bali was a spectacle. The image of the young American heiress accused of murdering her wealthy mother captivated the world's media. Heather sat in court with a calm, almost detached expression. Sometimes she smiled. Sometimes she laughed. To many, it seemed chilling, like she didn't fully grasp the gravity of what she had done. The prosecution painted her as manipulative, selfish, and cold. They argued that she lured her mother to Bali as part of a calculated plan to kill her and steal her fortune. Tommy confessed to striking the blows but insisted he did it in a fit of rage, not as part of a planned conspiracy. But text messages between the pair betrayed their story. They had discussed money. They had discussed hatred for Sheila. And most damning of all, they had discussed how to be rid of her. Sheila's family sat in the courtroom devastated. A woman who had devoted her life to raising her only daughter had been brutally murdered, and now they had to listen as her child justified it. One family member said through tears, "Sheila was difficult, yes, but she did not deserve this. No mother deserves this." The world watched as the toxic love story unraveled in front of cameras. What was left was not romance. It was betrayal. In April 2015, the verdict came. Heather Mack, 10 years in prison for her role in the murder. Tommy Schaefer, 18 years in prison for killing Sheila. The sentences shocked some. Critics argued they were far too lenient for such a brutal crime. Others pointed out that Indonesian courts often balance cultural context with sentencing, and Heather's youth was considered. But for Sheila's family, no sentence could heal the wound. Her sister later said, "We lost Sheila twice. First when she was killed, and then when we saw who killed her." In prison, Heather gave birth to her daughter, Stella. For a time, Stella lived in prison with her mother. The cycle of innocence and betrayal seemed to repeat itself, another child born into tragedy. Heather served 7 years before being released in 2021, deported back to the United States. But even in freedom, the shadow of the suitcase murder followed her. She now faces new legal battles over her inheritance, with prosecutors arguing she should never profit from her mother's death. The suitcase remains a haunting symbol of greed, rebellion, and a bond between mother and daughter broken in the most violent way imaginable. The case of Heather Mack forces us to face an unsettling truth. Family, the one place where love should be unconditional, can also be the stage for the darkest betrayals. Heather was not a starving child. She was not trapped in poverty. She had privilege, wealth, and opportunity. But in her eyes, her mother was not a protector. She was an obstacle. And so paradise turned into a graveyard, a suitcase became a coffin, and a daughter became her mother's executioner. The haunting question remains: was Heather a victim of a controlling mother, or simply a manipulative child who saw murder as the price of freedom? The answer may never bring peace, but the suitcase in Bali will always whisper of betrayal, greed, and the night a mother's love was beaten to death in a luxury hotel room.